And our last speaker is Jame Nikitine, who is part French, part Russian, part British. Look at this, we've had Chile, England, or half Welsh. It's like a multicultural melting pot in here today. So what's James going to be about? For nearly a decade, James has worked globally as a consultant in ocean science and policy communications on issues such as microplastics, pollution, climate change, impacts on the ocean, and deep reef research. He is co-founder and CEO of Manta Productions, a strategic communications and film production agency specializing in nature conservation, science, and livelihoods. He's been working for several years as a project manager and producer with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and has worked with the WWF. I'm presuming that's the Wildlife Fund, not the wrestling people. Cool, just checking. Could be an interesting mix-over. We have bear versus wrestler. Who will win? I'd pay to see that. The Ocean Acidification Alliance and the UK government. In 2019, he worked as media advisor for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in the context of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. We've got a lot of UN stuff going on here at this conference. We're knocking it out. From which this year's EnviroPAST conference theme was derived. He's a fellow with the Edmund Hillary Fellowship and recently founded Blue Cradle, a non-profit working in New Zealand promoting ocean conservation and literacy. Over to you, sir. The floor is yours. Round of applause for James.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Thank you. Wow, that was. Please come in. Tēnā koutou katoa. So yeah, it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. Ko James tuku ingoa, no French Alps ahau. So I'm from the French Alps. And yeah, today I'll talk to you about Blue Cradle, a little bit about me, a little bit about what we do. And yeah, so where to begin? I mean, for me, it's really inspiring to see so many young people here, and because we all go through youth, and so I've been a young person as well one day, and so yeah, it's really inspiring, and so yeah, it's real pleasure to be here. So I got to use that, and then so yeah, as Tim said, all that won't repeat it. What I will say though is. I wasn't always a consultant. I wasn't always a producer. I wasn't always the founder of Blue Cradle. Before, I was a diving instructor. So I worked on the Great Barrier Reef in Samoa roughly about 10 years ago. I just took a one-way flight when the global financial crisis hit in 2009, thereabouts. And I ended up in New Zealand, and then I ended up in Samoa. And then in Samoa, I then ended up on the Great Barrier Reef, and I saw the Great Barrier Reef every day. And so taking people diving just meant that I was teaching them turtle behavior, coral reef taxonomy, but also impacts and stresses that we are inflicting on this marine environment. And so at that point, I realized I want to do this. I want to do conservation. I want to do education. And I had a film degree, so I was a film graduate. So anyway, I went back to Geneva and my home city. And I ended up to get enrolled in Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, and then I worked on large marine protected area design. And I did my thesis on Pitcairn. I was unable to go there, but I was really passionate about the Pacific. And despite the fact that I was in Scotland, I thought I can still work in the Pacific. And so I did all the Skypes and the things to do a social science study, essentially on Pitcairn and how it was developed and how it became the largest marine protected area in the world back in 2015. Since then, I've been really interested in large MPA design and management, and so I'm still continuing in that space. My research was published, so I managed to publish it in Marine Policy, so I was pretty pleased with that. It took me 2 years from the thesis to publish it, but it's a process, so I encourage you to do it if you're doing your master's or even undergrad. Try and get your research published. It's really rewarding. And then I was fortunate enough to combine my skills, so marine science and film. And so I embarked on expeditions as a film producer and working with some pretty large multilateral organizations, IUCN, the Smithsonian, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, WWF as well, Pew Charitable Trusts. And I spent a month on the big boat, that one, Marion Dufresne, a French boat, looking at high sea seamounts. So we basically jumped in the water in the middle of the ocean. except it wasn't in the middle of the ocean because underwater there was a 20 meters below, there was a seamount, which was one of the shallowest seamounts in the world. So we actually surveyed it, went around it for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and we videoed it, we filmed it, we jumped in the water, and it was an amazing experience. It was one of those that you remember your whole life. We made a documentary about it. It's online. You can watch it. It's called The Last Frontier. I encourage you to watch it. It's French with English subtitles. And then the second one, I went on in that sub, and that was in 2018, 3 years ago, and that just made me realize just how much there is underwater that we don't know. And so being in a submersible is a fantastic experience. And we went down to 300 meters. We looked at mesophotic corals. I was next to probably one of the leading fisheries biologists in the world from Smithsonian, Carol Baldwin. And we were basically looking for, sampling. So like, using suction tubes and catching fish, essentially on the slopes of a uninhabited island in Curacao in the Dutch Caribbean. There's a film also that you can watch on Manaya Productions on our website. It's called At the Edge of Light. It shows you what we did on that expedition, during that expedition. And so it's really pretty fun. So that was what I did. And that was my, probably the best job in the world, really. At 30 years old, I thought, I'm on boats, filming, doing what I love, and communicating how important it is to study and learn about this stuff. Because let's face it, and this is one of my favorite photos ever. I didn't take it, just if you... it's Apollo 8, and it's called Earthrise, 1961, I think. It's our only home. That's Earth, as we know it. Planet ocean, 71%. And despite all the technology, all the reports that are published, the expeditions, we still know very little about it. Roughly 80% of it is undiscovered in terms of the ocean floor. We've mapped, 20% we've mapped. We've only discovered 10% of the marine species. There's 8 million species on land, roughly 1 to 2 million in the water, and we've only discovered 200,000. So that just gives you a scale. So anyway, my goal was to communicate what we don't know and trying to learn more and communicate. People, billionaires go into space, and space is great. I love space. I watch sci-fi movies all the time with my son, and so don't get me wrong. We need to go to space, but we need to know about our planet first. And this is our only home. If we blow this, there's no alternative. There's no planet B. Many people have said that before me. And so then this happened. And so, I'll spare you the details, but when you're a filmmaker and you travel the world for a living, you go on expeditions, and that was put to a halt by COVID very rapidly in April 2020. And so I was supposed to go to the Coral Triangle. I was actually producing a new series on the blue economy, looking at fisheries, looking at technology, and trying to tell the story of how we can work hand in hand with the ocean and save stuff, and have circular economy models, and provide livelihoods for coastal communities. That was the topic of my series I was going to do. It was called the Blue Cradle series, and COVID happened, so I was like, that's not going to happen. So instead, I decided to think. And how you went? And so I thought, okay, so what can I do in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, to make a difference? So then I scratched my head. I thought, well, why don't I set up an organization that's called Blue Cradle, that has for sort of at the core of what it is what I've just told you. So there's only one ocean, where we need to protect it, we need to communicate the science, we need to educate everyone, we need to be ocean-minded. And so that's when I came up with the logo, with a designer. We worked together, and so it's essentially all there. Cradle of life, the ocean. We come from the ocean, and we have sort of embedded in our DNA. We have this ocean kind, and so that's kind of what this logo represents. And we are the children of planet Earth, but we're also the children of planet Ocean. And so the Blue Cradle Foundation was born 2020 April last year, so a year on. Tim said it. I worked with the UN, and so when I was at the UN for probably about 6 months, I met some pretty senior scientists. And one of them was Jane Lubchenco, and she's fantastic. I encourage you to read her work. She's now working with John Kerry at the Capitol and the US government. So she wrote this op-ed with Stephen Gaines called A New Narrative for the Ocean, which essentially is about the capacity that we've had over the last few decades to inflict to the ocean what we couldn't believe was possible is we've actually diminished the ocean. We've actually made it so that, we've reached a tipping point where we could actually lose the ocean as an ecosystem, as a system, as a planetary functioning system. And so she said to us that, the ocean is not too big to fail. It's not too big to fix either. So we can actually change things. It's just too big to ignore. And so that really resonated in me. And she published this new narrative for the ocean. And when you hear Paul Watson say, the Sea Shepherd founder, if the oceans die, we die. And Sylvia Earle from Mission Blue, no blue, no green. So the ocean really is fundamentally important. And so we extract our existence from the ocean. And so that's really also at the core of what we're doing at Blue Cradle, is really building this, like I said, this field of, this community of practice to essentially build this, ocean kind, which, like, I've traveled the world, and there's thousands around the world of people who enjoy the ocean, know about the physical stuff happening in the ocean, the temperature changes, but also the biology. And I think if we really focus on this, we can actually solve some of our biggest challenges. And this is a map that I really like because it shows you it's one ocean. So it's an unusual map, but it's recently been coming out more and more. Ocean organizations are using it more and more. It's the Spillhouse projection. This is a map by Peters with some JEPCO and NASA data sets embedded in there. But it just shows you how interconnected the ocean is. In fact, you've got one ocean with several basins. You can see how New Zealand there is pretty much at the center of it. And so I just want you to remember that as you move on with your lives. But there is one ocean. Recently, the UN has changed World Oceans Day to World Ocean Day, 8th of June every year. So there's only one ocean. And so the vision of Blue Cradle really was also contributed by this, Tara. So Tara is a boat, which also known as Seamaster. So Sir Peter Blake Trust, some of you know. Raise your hand if you know Sir Peter Blake. Yeah, okay. So this boat was his boat a little while back. The French bought it, and they made it into a sailboat research vessel, and they've traveled the world since with mainly institutional and private funding to conduct research. So different kinds of research, plankton, microplastics, climate change, and they've sailed around the world. And their motto is to then communicate what they do directly with the audiences in the locations where they are. So coastal communities mainly, but also city dwellers. When I boarded this ship just to visit it, it was in Paris. So it was at the COP21 conference. It was on the River Seine, and there were conferences there. We learned about plankton. We learned about the recent expedition in the Pacific. And so that was really also my inspiration to starting Blue Cradle with 3 objectives: to promote a conservation and regeneration of the oceans, ecosystems, and species, to promote and support communities working in ocean health impact solutions in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and beyond, and to promote ocean literacy, marine science and conservation, and education, and ocean science for sustainable development. Ocean literacy is our relationship with the ocean and how we're connected to the ocean, and also how we can have an influence on the ocean, and also how the ocean can have an influence on us. So bearing that in mind, a bit more policy here, because that's also what I studied. Article 192 of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, actually states that the ratifying states, parties, have a general obligation to protect the marine environment. 192, 193. We also have the sovereign right to exploit our resources. And so having that in mind, that's really what we're about as well, is being able to have both. Being able to both protect the environment, but also benefit from its natural resources. And so we are working under the ocean literacy principles. You've got 7 of them there. The ocean has one big ocean with many features. The Earth, the ocean and life in the ocean shape the features on Earth. The ocean is a major influence on weather and climate. The ocean made Earth habitable. The ocean supports a great diversity of life and ecosystems. The ocean and humans are inextricably connected, and the ocean is largely unexplored. And we've just started this year, 2021, the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So 10 years to catch up, to play catch up on the data that we don't have about the ocean, and to also solve some of our biggest challenges in relation to the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the Ocean Decade really is what I call SDG 0. If you want, if you learn a lot more about the ocean, you can solve health problems, food security, energy, all of the other SDGs. So that's really what Blue Cradle is also, attempting to connect with. And I think here in Aotearoa, we have a unique offering, is because we have Te Ao Māori and we have Matauranga Māori. And I think that's where we really can showcase a difference in the world, because there's unique knowledge here that's passed on from generation to generation, and that needs to come to the foreground, because the world is trying to find solutions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. A lot of people out there believe that Western science isn't necessarily the only solution. There are other alternative solutions, knowledge, ways, and I think that's where we really need to put a lot of energy and effort into showcasing that to the world. So, just to sum up, Blue Cradle, and then we'll go into the plastics. Ocean data demand is high. There's not a lot of boats around. We need better ocean literacy education, and we're very well positioned geographically because we have a lot of ocean around us. So, who knows what this is? Little penguin. Actually, it's a little bit more than that. It's a white flippered penguin. And this is the only bird that's endemic to Canterbury. Did you know that? No. So it's located all around Banks Peninsula. And so our first project, we were approached by Pohatu Penguins. We managed to get ECAN and Rata Foundation funding, and we got Orbica, a GIS company, to work with us on a strategy to identify where these penguins are located. So we went out with 60 volunteers last year in November, and we're going out again this November. So if you are around, we're looking for volunteers to identify burrows, essentially looking for penguin poo. And then we can identify where the burrow is. We look whether there's chicks, whether there's a couple in there or a single chick, and then we basically record the data on our smartphones. And we basically came up with this 3D map, and we're going to continue monitoring penguins. And so what Blue Cradle did is we made a documentary about it. That one. We presented it at the Antarctic Center, and that's what we're about. We're about outreach, education, breaking the barrier of ocean science and conservation, and making sure that people have access to this information. So the film is now currently being negotiated, but we presented it, and it's going to be soon released, hopefully on national television. So big thanks to the Antarctic Center and to Kororatahi Creative and Happen Films for making this happen. Our second project, this is more relevant to why we're here today, is plastics. So we're working with ESR here in Christchurch and the MB project AIM2, so Aotearoa Impacts and Mitigation of Microplastics, which aims to understand the levels, the distribution of microplastics around Aotearoa, New Zealand, and moving ahead with the right decisions. So as you know, we've seen this throughout the presentations over the last day. Plastics was invented in 1907. It's a synthetic polymer. There's 9.5 million tons, I think it should say million tons, enter the ocean every year. And we have lots of fauna and flora problems with it, but also human pollution because it's entering our bodies. Essentially, we've discovered now that it's entered the placentas of women. So there's a recent report that came out. It's really worrying. It's in our drinking water, it's in our food, it's everywhere. Just to make a small difference here, there's primary and secondary microplastics. So the primary ones, just to sum up, is they're the ones that break down, that they're already under 5 millimeter in size, and they go directly in the marine environment as such. The official definition is there. The secondary microplastics actually degrade. So I made a little film for IUCN, which I'll now show you. And if, Tim, you could turn the light off, please. It's only 2 minutes. Yeah. It should work again. Yeah.
Marine plastic pollution has become a critical challenge of our times. Since the 50s, 8,300 million tons of plastic has been produced, 4,600 million tons discarded, and 600 million tons recycled. 400 million tons are produced annually, and 8 million tons flow into our oceans every year. This amount of pollution will double by 2030 and quadruple by 2050. Plastic pollution threatens ocean and human health, contributes to climate change, and has serious economic and financial implications. Larger pieces, known as macroplastics, accumulate in ocean gyres, wash up on beaches, harm marine ecosystems, and impact coastal communities. Smaller pieces, known as microplastics and nanoplastics, travel through the air and water column. Breaking down from larger pieces, coming from the abrasion of tires, loss of microbeads, clothes fibers, or paints, these particles enter the food chain. But where does all this plastic come from in the first place? Initially a mineral oil resource, the building blocks of all plastics are pellets, which are shaped into different products. At the end of their life, plastics can be incinerated or recycled, but an important majority are improperly discarded and accumulate in landfills or the environment. Plastic pollution is caused by inadequate waste management systems, as well as by microplastic leakages during the lifespan of plastic products. Sewage systems, rivers, and discarded items at sea, such as ghost nets, are some of the ways plastic enters our oceans. Every day around the world, we use millions of single-use plastics. We need to shift from today's linear take, make, dispose model to a more circular economy in plastics value chain, where products are designed to be reused or recycled and consumption reduced. To address plastic pollution, new materials are being developed. Bioplastics, which are made from natural materials, biodegradable plastics, which are broken down by living organisms, and compostable plastics, designed to decompose in a composting facility. These innovations are still at an early stage and require as well to be properly managed and disposed of. Beyond these solutions, we need consumer behavior change, new product and technological innovations, and comprehensive legal frameworks and tax incentives. The Mar Plastics Initiative was launched in 2018 in 5 countries, with the ambition to expand its geographical scope. It includes 4 main components: increased knowledge, improved policies, engaged business, and catalyzed capacities.
So this was produced with support from the Swedish Development Agency and IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, in the context of the report release looking at primary microplastics. And so as I said before, there's 7 main sources: tires, textiles, coatings, paints, road markings, plastic pellets, city dust. And so Blue Cradle, as an organization, we embarked in a partnership to combine both the microplastics issue, but also biosecurity. As Rachel mentioned earlier, plastics in the marine environment, they can be vectors of biosecurity issues as rafts. And so we basically started a work stream in partnership with ESR, Cawthron, Algalita, and with support from Foundation North and Hansaworld, also the University of Auckland and Far Out, to look at data collecting in the New Zealand marine environment and combining basically 2 major research projects funded by MB, the Marine Biosecurity Toolbox and AIM2, which I talked about before. And so for the last 9 months, we've been working on this, and we just had our scientific inaugural expedition just a few weeks ago. So what we did is we essentially got a platform. As Blue Cradle, that's what we do. We find platforms, and we got a boat. We got the scientific teams together, and we planned a schedule. And you can see we zigzagged our way up from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, through Hauraki Gulf, all the way up north to Opua Bay of Islands. And we stopped along the way for outreach. So the dream had come true. The Tara voyage is now happening here at a much smaller scale. But basically what we did is we surveyed 27 sites, Each team had a dedicated component, so biosecurity for Cawthron, ESR Microplastics with Algalita, and also we had MetOcean on board, so we're doing a temperature profile as well. And so we did 15 minutes for each trawl, 3 per site, and we used as well a different tool called a high-speed cruise net to use different cod ends to collect water, and with a plankton filter be able to then collect eDNA. So that's what Cawthron were doing. And the fishing rod was used for temperature profiles, and that's what the MetOcean team were doing. And so we zigzagged our way up. Waiheke, the noises, Little Barrier, Lee, and that's our boat. Or it's not our boat, but it's the boat we used. So it's called Manawa Nui. It's 22 meters based in Opua Bay of Islands, and it's typically a marine mammal research vessel. So they conduct marine mammal research around Aotearoa, primarily looking for false killer whales. So if you go to Far Out Ocean Collective's website, you can see they've been doing this for 20 years, and they're very experienced in the region where we're at. And so Jochen, our skipper, looked after us with Gaia and Lily, and we had 22 scientists at different legs, so 15 at a time, but we had people on, people off, and we lived on the boat. We had dinner and lunch and breakfast on the boat, and it was fantastic. It was a fantastic experience, which is what marine science is also all about. It's about the human experience. And so Manawa Nui, at the back, you have a large rear deck where you can deploy instruments. So you can see us here deploying a Manta trawl, which effectively is like a Manta-shaped device with wings which float, which sits on the surface, and you tow it at 4 knots roughly. And so you need 2 to 3 people to operate it, 2 to put it in the water. So you have 2 scientists here putting it in the water with the ropes, and you roughly tow it 15 to 20 meters behind the boat. And then the third person records data. So you record wind speed, location, so GPS position, and so on and so forth. And when we retrieve the Manta after 15 minutes, we then filter on board. So a filter station looks like this. You have a lot of water involved, and you got to use sprays and basically get rid of all the organic material. And you repeat the procedure twice because we did 15-minute trawls at each site. And then navigating as well. So going from one site to the next was a lot of navigating. And so weather dependent, very heavily weather dependent. And so data is currently being analyzed at the lab at ESR just next door. And so we'll hopefully have some preliminary results very soon. We didn't have any issues. We just weren't able to survey Great Barrier Island, which was a bit too far because of the weather. But otherwise, we really had a great sampling journey, and we collected some microplastics, which is unfortunate, I suppose, but at the same time, it will shed light on whether it's bad or very bad or how bad it is. I think what was really interesting is to compare the heavily populated areas like Auckland Harbour, where we did some inner harbour sampling. We did one on the left side of the harbour bridge, for example, where there's State Highway 16. And we did some way like in front of pretty much Rangitoto, if you know that area. But then we also did some way out on the other side of Little Barrier Island. So comparing whether there's a high abundance in those sites, in comparison to other sites, might be really interesting to see. But I'm presuming a lot of fibers, as we were discussing earlier. On the biosecurity side, that's the device they launched. It looks like a toilet seat, but it's not. It's a modified cruise net, so it's been used on oceanographic expeditions. And what they're doing is like I said before, they're looking for eDNA, so using filters in the cod end there. And then they're doing different experiments using water, like a catcher versus none. So essentially being able to go straight to the filtration ramp as soon as possible with the water. So then you're able to identify, collect as much organic matter as possible. And so these guys were very much looking at invasive species, looking at how later they can basically analyze the data and use a genetic device called I forgot the name. But anyway, it's like a little box that is now making things incredibly faster in terms of eDNA detection. And so what they were looking for was mainly these guys, Sabella spallanzani, which are invasive species, which spread throughout marinas, and they come from the Mediterranean, as their name indicates, but they're not supposed to be here. And the third team was looking at temperature profiles, so using the MangroPARE sensor here, essentially deploying it, towing it, and then being able to see what the temperature was at specific depths. So we used the fishing rod, which was never been used before, and the MetOcean team, a part of the Moana project, they're going to deploy over 300 of these on fishing vessels all around New Zealand to be able to collect community science data. So once again, another example of innovation, collaboration made possible by this expedition. And so one of the unique things we did is along the way, we stopped. And so big up to Auckland University and Tim at the Lee Marine Discovery Center who hosted us, and Lee School who turned up. And we had a good 2-hour workshop with the kids. So we berthed in Lee Harbor. We saw orca in the harbor, and that was just an amazing experience. We were on the dinghy, and we saw a couple of orca pop up. That was really just amazing. And then we went to the Marine Discovery Center and gave a talk. The children were able to see the scientific devices in action there and learn more about microplastics and the marine environment and biosecurity. And then we had a workshop. So Northland Regional Council organized a workshop for us. We had about 50 people talking from MPI, Scion, Polytech, and the local iwi, Patuha Harakeke. And so we basically talked about eDNA and microplastics and how we can make these processes a lot simpler and understand how we can actually have faster identification of these issues in the marine environment. And so, yeah, that was a great success as well. It's really what Blue Cradle is about. It's about the science and the outreach. The next day, we had 4 schools on our boat. That's Whangarei Intermediate. And so we are looking at making more of this sort of activities, making ocean science more accessible. So really replicating this model is what we have in mind. Looking at Canterbury, because there's not a lot of ocean education around here. So we're looking at doing more of that. So that was a frank success. This really, for me, was the highlight of our trip. When you're on the ship and you have kids just in awe, seeing the boat, meeting the scientists, and we had a great day for it as well. And doing exercises on the deck of the boat. Does the plastic sink? Does it float? What kind of microplastic is it? So we had all these testing devices and riding on forms, and yeah, it was really amazing. And we'll turn the light off one more time, Tim, because I'll show you what the voyage was like. Because we are preparing a documentary, but it's not finished, so this is just a little taster.
I'm so excited. What is it?
So we're going to complement the documentary with another cruise. So next October, we're going to board another ship, and that'll be me after that. Arvi Stranik, currently in Lilton, and we're going to conduct sampling in Fjordland. So stay tuned. There'll be more Blue Cradle expeditions as we move forward to continue this mahi. If you want to get involved, come and talk to me. We always need motivated people. And yeah, namihi. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, questions.
Yeah.
We've got microphones. We've lost our microphoner. Oh, there he is, photographer, microphoner. Are you? Oh, you just got excuses, man. I'll take one. Oh, we'll make it really.
I was just wondering, what are ways that us as students, like, how can we get involved?
I think there's lots of ways you can get involved if this is still working.
Yep.
As a volunteer, I mean, I started in the conservation space as a volunteer. So I started in 2015 before I started my company with IUCN as a young volunteer. So I went to events. I managed to get scholarships, and then you just work your way up. You just you put your hand up, and you just go for it. With Blue Cradle specifically, we're always looking for volunteers. We have, as I said earlier, we have a penguin survey coming up with our partners in November, December. So we will be looking for people to train up, to be fit enough to go out in the rocks and use scientific skills to look for penguins. So if you're interested in penguins, or if you're interested in something else,
Do you have like an email or like a?
It should be. It was there, but Tim got rid of it. Or these guys.
Okay. Thank you.
Those guys.
It's them. It's them.
Just go to www.bluecradle.org. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah.
This is like a weird question, I guess. But going back to that Mediterranean fanworm stuff, I thought it looked really whack. You said it was an invasive species and it was detrimental to our environment. In like what ways does it affect our own biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, it does look pretty whack. I mean, I was at the New Zealand Marine Science Conference just a couple of weeks ago, and on the last evening we had our dinner, and the scientists from that expedition, they had Sabella fanworms on their hats. They made like little, it was amazing. And so I think they're pretty, but when you see them in the marina, they're everywhere. So it's a habitat thing. So there's competition for habitats everywhere, ecosystem-wise. So if you have a species that just come and thrives, just eats up all the space, and then that just removes the rest of the space for the natural indigenous species that are there. So that's sort of where we're at in terms of that. Of course, they're not, negative per se. They're not going to eat. They're not, corrosive or whatever. They're not like dangerous or anything. But it's a competition thing. So you don't want to have too many of these invasive species. Otherwise, you just have some.
The native funworms in New Zealand are much smaller than the Mediterranean. So it basically competes for their food and their space.
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect timing.
You got one here.
Sorry, we got one. Yeah, we'll get the microphone.
I've heard twice from iwi that the presence of the southern right whale travelling along the east coast of Northland and Kauri dieback are somehow linked through historical past. And can you comment on things like cultural relationships around environmental change, please?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in marine mammals, but what I do know is that there's a lot of conservation programs around the world that are now adopting a mountains to sea approach to their work. So it's not so much segmented, separated, but forestry, freshwater, coastal, and then offshore. It's more like integrated. And even DOC now, they've launched a new mountains to sea team. And so I've worked a little bit in tropical islands, ecosystem spaces in Samoa and Fiji and the Caribbean. And it works like there as well with the ridge to reef. In terms of the cultural aspects, I think there's a lot to learn from local hapu and local governance of the natural resources. And some of the best, I think, examples of that are Maitaitais and the Taiapures and the Rahuis, and you have that across the Pacific everywhere. Those ancient, ways of governing the marine environment, but also the land environment. And I think that's what we need. We need more local governance, and we had, decision-making systems that enable the community to voice their concerns. And that's what we need. And also mahinga kai. So being able to actually feed yourself off the marine environment, which is exactly what we talked about before with Article 192 and 193. We have to protect the marine environment, but we shouldn't close it off. It's like we should be able to live off it as well. So it's finding that right balance. And I think mountains to sea, and I'm not sure about the southern right whale context, but I do know that coast was just amazing. You saw a bit of footage there, but it's just thriving with life. And I found out later that Far Out Ocean Collective, they're out there now actually looking for the whales, and they go frequently in the Cape Reinga area, and there's thousands of sightings of mola mola and whale sharks and great whites as well. It's a very, very abundant area in terms of marine wildlife. Yeah. Thank you. There's one here.
I just heard you mention a couple times about documentaries that you made with your team. I was wondering how those documentaries that you've mentioned could be used to kind of positively impact communities that are affected by ocean pollution, or just how we as students can also use those things that you've created to help.
So typically, I was responding to a call for proposals, working directly with multilateral organizations or foundations, and so it's a sort of a commercial relationship. They hired me to make films, but they hired me because of my expertise. So I was able to then convey both the science, but also the emotion and sort of the human aspects of marine science. So if you go to our website, you can see some of those films, which are free to use. They're available on our website on manayaproductions.com, and then a lot of them are also in the public space. So IUCN is a multilateral organization, and so a lot of our work is on their website as well. WWF, Pew, and you're free to use those. You can use it as a pedagogical resource. You can organize a talk. They're on YouTube, so you can just hope that helps.
Last one.
Yeah, mate.
How do we begin to heal coral reefs that are dying out because of our pollution?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, coral reefs for me are very special, and so there's a lot of work being done around the world on different strategies, marine protection, so closing off areas, making sure that there's less runoff, so particularly thinking of agricultural runoff and places like that. But in terms of the bigger one, it's climate change. So climate change, warming oceans, bleaching. So you've had the largest bleaching event in the last few years in the Great Barrier Reef, 2014 to 2017. Half of the Great Barrier Reef was pretty much killed. And so there's a lot of scientists that I know of that are doing different things. They're trying different geoengineering solutions. I've heard of controversial solutions like whitening the clouds above the reef, cooling the water. No, it's for real. Well, yeah. That's all happening, and it's all funded. So it's like there's millions being poured at that, finding solutions. The best hope right now is in the Red Sea. There's the Swiss government actually working with the government of Jordan, I think Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I think. And they're working on some resilient reefs there. So there's a lot to learn at the genetic level as well through coral reefs. So some are more resistant to others, to heat stress and to pollution. So hopefully there's some hope there for coral reefs. But there will be winners, there will be losers. And we are going to face some significant death if we don't lower our greenhouse emissions immediately. Yeah.
Cool. So I was wondering, you said you did filmmaking back in uni?
Yeah.
So did you do underwater filmmaking, or was it something you just sort of picked up and blended with your dive sort of experience?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question. It's a skill that I learned along the way. So when I worked on the Great Barrier Reef as a dive guide, I was dive guide / photographer. So they sort of give you a camera and say, I take photos while you're at it. And so you got to make sure the Nemo's in the shot as well as the diver. Because then they buy the photo for sure. And then they take it home. It's like, look, I was on the Great Barrier Reef. So you got to do that. And then so from there, I was like, okay, now I need to buy my own gear. So I saved up for like 5 years because it costs a lot to get your own gear. And then you, basically I did a course actually in the UK. I went in a quarry, which was an interesting experience, let's say, diving in a quarry near Manchester. And it was like in the middle of April or something. Water was 12 degrees. Anyway, but I did like a underwater videography course there, and I just learned how to use the aperture and just learn a bit more. So yeah, it's a thing you learn and you develop and you get better and better over time. Yeah. White balance is the key. It is really, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Round of applause.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.